Hello everybody, today we're going to look at hooks in React.js. We're going to look at why they're useful, we're going to look at how to use them, we're going to look at the three main React hooks that are provided by the core React framework, and we're going to have a step-by-step example of making an API call using useState and useEffect. Now, React at the time of recording this video is at version 17, and hooks have only appeared in version 16.8 in February 2019. So they're a fairly recent thing, but in my opinion, and in pretty much everybody else's opinion, they're a really good thing. Why? Because they give code superpowers, and they make it more fun. Because they make our code easier to read, faster to develop in, and just generally more powerful. Now, how does that work? In the old days, before 2019, a React component was built with classes. The big question around JavaScript frameworks, Angular, Vue, React, has always been about managing state, and it's been an ongoing question since the very start of these applications. I mean, you don't need JavaScript to generate HTML. PHP has been doing that very well for the last 30 years or so. The point of JavaScript frameworks is to manage application logic, and dare I say even game logic. And well, classes was a logical way of doing things. You just lump everything together. The state, the initialization, the logic, the HTML render, it's a logical place to put everything together. And normally you can't manage state with only a function. Any local variables that you declare within the function are lost when the function exits. A function is like a gadfly. It lives, it dies, and it forgets. But hooks allow us to leave the heavy lifting to the framework, to bring out the boring, repetitive stuff and to focus on the fun stuff, the logic, the presentation. This means that our code is more streamlined, more readable. It means we can just focus on the fun stuff, on how we want our application to look and to behave. It also means that we can write a function and not a class. Just one single function that takes the state, the calling variables, and renders the HTML that we want to show. Like I said, React hooks are cool because they give our code superpowers, and superpowers are fun. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. And to work well, these hooks need to be used in the proper manner. Thankfully, it's not very complicated to do. But before we go into the details of how that works, perhaps it's worth me introducing myself. Hi, if we haven't met before, my name is David, and I've spent about 20 years of my life developing games in the video game industry. And for me, learning is a never-ending journey of joy. And coding itself is a game of logic, a game of exploration, and more than anything else, a game of construction. I love to build things, and it's my passion to share this joy. So let's dive right in. Oh wait, before we do that, if you're finding this video useful, nay, dare I said, even if you're finding this video fun, please don't smash that like button. Please just gently click it. That like button has been suffering enough under the harsh batterings of all these people smashing it. A gentle click is all that's needed. That button is innocent. Poor button. Anyway, roll music. So, as I was saying, the magic of hooks has one simple requirement, and one requirement only. That requirement is that the hooks be all called every time in the same order whenever the function is run. This means they shouldn't be behind a condition. So something like if flag, then use hook, that won't work. That's bad. So the way to work this correctly is just to put all the hooks at the top of the function in sequence, and that allows you to be sure they'll all be called at the same time at the beginning. The second thing to note is a naming convention. The names of hooks always start with use, or should start with use, then something, the name, use something. So, for example, use state, use effect, use translation, use query, and as my mum used to say, use your head. And the idea of hooks and this naming convention is hooks take and use functionality from other places inside the framework. Now that that's out of the way, let's look at the different hooks, what they do and how you can use them. Now, there are a number of different hooks, and you can actually write your own, and if you're interested in learning how to do that, leave me a comment and I'll post a video explaining how to do it. But that's a subject for another day. We'll be looking at the 3 core hooks that I use the most and that are provided by the React framework. There's use state, which manages state, use effect, which creates side effects, and use context, which allows you to share data across an application. Now, in my daily work, I often use 2 other different hooks. One is use translation that comes from the i18 Next library, and that allows us to translate the application. The other is use query and use mutation, and these are hooks that allow us to query and to send mutations to a GraphQL backend, and those are provided by the Apollo client. And I'll let me know in the comments if either of those 2 is of interest, and I'll explain how to use them. Now, enough about that. Let's look at our hooks. The first one is use state. Use state manages state. Duh. Use state allows the function to remember what's been going on between the times that it was run. It allows the function to remember stuff. The syntax is fairly simple. We have use state, which we initialize with the initial value, and that returns 2 things. It returns the current state, and it returns the setter that allows us to define the state. So for example, const counter, set counter equals use state 0, which means counter is going to be equal to 0, and if we do set counter of counter plus 1, counter will be equal to 1, and will stay equal to 1 every time the function is run. Use effect allows us to run side effects. The side effect is something that is run as a side effect, obviously, and it allows us to execute other stuff either the first time the component is mounted, the first time it's run, or when stuff changes. The syntax is fairly simple. We have a use effect, and inside the first parameter is the function that's to be run, and the second function is the list of values that the hook is going to look at, and when they change, it's going to trigger the side effect. So basically, this is how we call an API on the first run of the application, or at later runs. We'll see about how to use that later on in the walkthrough example. Now, use context creates a global variable. It's something that's akin to a singleton, and the reason why it exists is because sometimes you can have content that is shared throughout the application. For example, a good example is the username. The username, we want to show it in a hello, or whoever you are. We want to show it in a pop-up. We want to show it and so on. Is the kind of thing that isn't updated very often, but that needs to be shared throughout the application. And one way of doing that is just of passing props all the way through, so that the main component indicates in the props what the username is to the second component, and then so on, so on, so on. And that means all the props have a username prop inside it. But that's called prop drilling, and it's fairly ugly. Can get fairly ugly. And the proper way of doing this is to have the context that we define at the top, and then throughout the application we can put in that context, use the context, and that'll give us the correct value to that we're looking at. And now we're going to have a look at the practical example using Next.js and Axios. It actually works the same way in React, in vanilla React, and we're going to be using use state and use effect, and use that to call an API and to see how that works. let's get going. Okay, so here I've got an application, a Next.js application that I've simply created with create next app. We're just going to start diving in and putting in our state and our use effect. The first thing I want to do is just create a state that's going to contain the data that I'm going to retrieve from the API. So I've created a variable called joke. I'm going to put it here, joke, and I've initialized it with the joke. Not much there, not very funny. And so now what we're going to do is going to set up use effect, and in this use effect we're going to set up a function. The variables that we're going to watch are for the moment going to be empty, so it only starts on the initial start of the component. And we're going to use Axios, and we're going to get data from the API, and then the return data we are going to read, and we're going to set the joke from ret data value once we do that, we have the joke that appears in our component. Now obviously what would be nice is to be able to refresh the joke. I can actually do this by just reloading it, and that will work, but it would be nice if we could do it with a click of a button. So what we're going to do here is start by create a button, and that button is going to say click me gently. And we're going to create another state. Setting in a number. Now this one, counter, we're going to show here. So it's now going to initialize. Numbers, here's a counter, here's the joke. If I click here gently, nothing happens. Click equals set counter plus 1. So here when we click, the counter updates. It doesn't actually update the joke, and the reason for this is very simple. Simply we haven't inserted the counter here in the variables that the use effect needs to watch to know when to update the joke. So here, there we go. And if I click, it updates. There we go. Very simple use case for using a state, and for using the state and for using use effect to get an API, the value from a return value from an API in Next.js, and also of course in React. Thank you very much. I hope this was of value. If it was, please like the video and see you soon. Bye.